Hello, dearest friends. I'm today going to talk about a topic which I have alluded to many times in prior podcasts, but never really fully explored. Um, and the reason I'm going to do this is because continuously we get comments, uh, both on the channel and in other locations, forums, whatever, that this channel is pro-Catholic, pro-Roman Catholic. And somehow this channel is trying to convert you, the listener, to Roman Catholicism. Okay. Now, that's an absurd statement, but we have to examine why that statement's being made, why it's so common. Okay. So let's start at the beginning with who are the two by twos? Where did they start? Well, they started in Northern Ireland. Okay, and what is Northern Ireland? Northern Ireland is an English colony. Okay, England colonized Ireland. Ireland was Roman Catholic, entire population. Northern Ireland, after Irish it was Irish Republican Revolution and the granting of the becoming of the Republic of Ireland, there was still one part that was remained part of the United Kingdom, which is Northern Ireland. Okay. And why? Because there's a large number of non-Catholics in Northern Ireland. Who are they? They're mostly Scots. Okay. And they came there from a long time ago. But and these are there's sort of churches, two major churches operating at the same time in Northern Ireland: the Church of England or the Church of Northern Ireland, which is basically Anglicanism, and then the Roman Catholic Church. And these two are in constant the people who are parts of different congregations are hate each other. And it's not they don't hate each other because of the faith. The reason the hatred is there is because the colonization of Ireland by the English. Okay. And there was all kinds of laws that were discriminatory against Roman Catholics. Okay. For example, you couldn't go to university, you couldn't become a council member, you couldn't become a member of parliament unless you swore allegiance to the Church of England, which is Anglicanism. Okay. So if you're Roman Catholic, there's an enormous amount of Roman Catholic, like, um, say, prejudice within the United Kingdom. And this is a result of the breakaway of under Henry VIII. Okay, it's a long time, long period, things going on after that, but basically there were many laws put into place to discriminate against Roman Catholics and to persecute. Okay, and so in our Northern Ireland is like a crucible of this, say, conflict between Roman Catholics and Anglicans within the United Kingdom. Okay, so if you were not a Roman Catholic in Northern Ireland, you would most likely have a very anti-Catholic outlook. Okay, you would have picked up a lot of prejudicial ideas about Roman Catholic Church. Now, there within the Church of England itself, there are people who think the Church of England is too Catholic. Okay, yeah, it's true, and um they broke away, right? They ended up starting up their own denominations, right? So the Methodists, you know, things like this. Obviously, the Puritans. If you're an American, you know the story of the Puritans, so forth. Okay, so in Northern Ireland during the time of the late 1800s, it's no surprise that you have these sorts of ideas popping up, these very anti-Catholic and anti-Anglican ideas coming out of these extremists like William Irvine. Okay. And so these, we call them anti-establishment church ideas. Okay. Because the Church of England is what's called an established church, meaning it's a state church. The state funds it, the state gives its money. Okay. And the Roman Catholic Church in the Republic of Ireland was a state church. Okay, as a state church in France and a state church in Spain and in Italy and so forth. So to be anti-establishment church is to means what I just said. And so these William Irvine and his followers were anti-established church. Okay. And they consider these established churches, which are primarily Roman Catholic Church and the Anglican Church, as being, the whore of Babylon, right? That's, and of course, I mean, if you go to any town, any village, I mean, there's 10 people in a village, there's going to be an established church in that village. So they see it as omnipresent. They see it as it's ubiquitous. They see it as oppressive. Okay, basically, it's everywhere against them. They consider it persecuting them. In fact, right. So that's where this strain of anti-established church within the two by twos begins, and it's just stoked when the two by twoism comes to the United States. It latches on to some already existing anti-established church ideas in the United States. Now, most people don't know the history of religion in the United States, but the United States was initially the founders in different parts of what we look 13 colonies had different variants of Christianity, right? So like, in the south part, like the Carolinas, Georgia, that those were Church of England people, okay? In the Boston, Massachusetts Bay Colony, those were Puritans. Those are people who broke away from the Church of England. They said the Church of England was too papist, okay? And even amongst themselves, they had fights. They're saying that one section was saying the other section was not extreme enough, right? So we know like the Roger Williams who left the Massachusetts Bay Colony and went to what became Rhode Island and set up a church there. Okay. Then there were also groups called Congregationalists, whose the state of Connecticut was their area. Okay. And then of course there's William Penn with Pennsylvania, basically sort of a open to any kind of extremist groups, right? And then but there was a compromise in the state of Maryland, and that was the place where there were a lot of Roman Catholics came there, and so it there was no say state religion in the state of Maryland. Anyways, as you can see, almost all of the places that I mentioned in the Northeast of the United States of those colonies were anti-established church, and that variant or that culture is embedded in the United States culture, anti-established church. Okay. And it has really taken off because since the colonial days, it really taken off because of an influx of other types of people from other parts of Europe who were, let's say, opposed to the established churches that were in Europe. Okay, so who are we talking about? Well, the Huguenots, for one. The Huguenots are a Protestant group from France. So they were obviously opposed to the Roman Catholic Church because they're from France. So they settled a large part of what's called New Jersey, northern New Jersey, and the Hudson Valley. Then we have a lot of other types of groups that are same sort of thing, like from Germany. There was a large number of breakaway German groups that came. Now, I don't know if you are aware, but the largest ethnic group in the United States is German. Okay, and it's primarily across the entire center of the country. Um, Another thing that happened was the African Americans in the South, they created, or amongst them was created a movement to break away from the Church of England of the slaveholding class, right? And that breakaway group became is they basically they became Baptists. So there's a large Black American Baptist contingent. Okay. Again, as you can see, I'm just talking through all of these anti-establishment groups in the United States. And then, of course, we have the Mormons, right? Who founded their entire state and today encompass, huge more than Utah. It's most of Idaho and other surrounding borderlands of the surrounding states of Utah. It's enormous. And that is why when you go into many towns in the United States, there's all sorts of churches that are not established churches. Okay. Okay. So this antithesis towards established churches that comes out of Northern Ireland with the two by twos finds very fertile ground in the United States. Okay. Now, this also exists in Australia for similar reasons, and it exists in Western Canada for similar reasons. And I guess in some degree in Southern Ontario. It doesn't exist in Quebec. Okay. That's why there's very few two by twos in Quebec. And it doesn't really exist in in other areas of the world where there's the established churches are quite popular. Okay. Okay. So if you're anti-established church, as the two by twos are, you're going to try to find any critiques of the established churches to justify your anti-established church position, right? That makes sense. And so that's very common amongst two by two ministers and elders and through the culture of the two by twos. So what do? They basically they don't know anything about these established churches in terms of they've never been inside them in terms of a member for a long period and understood it. No, what they do is they take a superficial glance at it and then they critique it, right? So a common critique, which I've heard repeated on another podcast just this week from X two by two, was that there's people in these established churches are just mindlessly repeating liturgy. Okay. Mindlessly repeating liturgy or just doing rote prayers. Like they're not actually like putting their heart into it with Jesus. Okay. Now, in these X2 by 2's defense, I will say there are certainly people in the congregations of the established church who are just mindlessly there. There's no question about it. I'm sure, but that's just the case, and it's also the case in two by twos, right? There are people who are mindlessly there. So that's not critique. It is not the case that everyone who's in an established church in the congregation is mindless about what's going on. Many people are heavily involved in the liturgy. And it's like, why do they have a liturgy in the first place? Why is there rote prayers? It's because those prayers, that liturgy was written using the words in the Gospels. Okay. So it's just going through the liturgy itself is like the entire messages of the Gospels are being presented to you. Right? You're in getting deeply infused into the concepts. And who wrote these things? Just someone? No. These are very smart theologians and from the history, in the last 2,000 years. And these liturgies have been constantly refined and tweaked to make them more and more, um, let's say accurate with the Gospels. Okay. So that's why I always say if you go to a liturgical mass, you will always be presented with the gospel because it's embedded inside the liturgy. Now, of course, if you don't know that, if you don't know that the gospel's very well, or if you don't, the words don't click, you don't see that they're in the liturgy, then you think the liturgy is just a bunch of mumble jumble. No, that's why people like two by twos or X two by twos who go into these things think these people are mindlessly repeating things. No, they're not. These have deep meaning because they're completely straight out of the Gospels. They're key words, key phrases that are taken from the Gospel, key pieces. Okay. So I would also say, though, in defense of these X2 by 2s or anybody who's critical of establishment churches, is that established churches are generally their own worst enemies. What do I mean? I'm going to tell you that even with the biggest people who have the greatest critiques about the Roman Catholic Church, for example, are Roman Catholics. And also at the same token, some of the worst examples of Roman Catholics are Roman Catholics. I mean, we've got tons of people who say they're Roman Catholics who are really committing all kinds of problems. Okay, right? All kinds of problems. Very total hypocrites, whatever. And I'm going to give you a little insight into this. There's a very famous book called the Decameron. It's written by Boccaccio. Okay, this is in Italy. Okay, this is just around the time of the Black Death, the Great Plague. It's a very famous book. It's in the Western canon, and it's comprised of about 100 short stories. And one of the stories is about a man who's living in a village in Italy at the time, and he's a Christian, obviously, he's Roman Catholic, and because everybody is, right? So he decides he wants to convert his neighbor who's a Jew, and he's been talking to his neighbor and trying to convert him for decades, and the Jew won't agree to anything. He just listens, but he doesn't say anything. And one day, his neighbor Jew says, "Oh, I'm going to go to Rome for a week. I have some business." And so the Christian, he says to himself, "I can't imagine. I cannot. My whole project of trying to convert this guy is going to be gone now because if he goes to Rome, he's going to see all of the degeneracy that goes on there. He's going to see all those cardinals with their mistresses and all this stuff and all of them living in luxury. Oh my goodness. If he sees this, he's never going to convert ever." So off the Jew goes to Rome, comes back in a couple of weeks, and the his neighbors, "Okay, how was your trip to Rome?" Expecting to hear, awful, awful what he saw and the litany of terrible things he saw. No, the Jew says, "Well, I converted to Christianity. I'm a Roman Catholic now." And just, the fellow says, "What are you talking about?" He says, "Well, I figure if this church, the Roman Catholic Church, can withstand having those cardinals who are such evil people, this must be the correct way." Okay, I know this is a sort of a joke, but there's a lot of truth in that. There's a lot of truth in that. That even though the Roman Catholic Church has had horrible things go on by people who are supposedly leaders or congregants of it or whatever, the fact is that it as an institution um, continues on and has done enormous good things. Okay, what good things do you say? What good you think I'm just saying it? No. This is again, a lot of people don't know the history around these things and they take things out of context. They're going to say, well, the Roman Catholic Church persecuted these people or the Cathars or they did the Inquisition or whatever. So the Gaullies critiques, okay, those things happened, no question, but they all have to be put in context. Okay. And so let me just step back. In 14, in the mid fifth century, which is in the 400s, the Western Roman Empire, okay, which comprises what we call Western Europe, it collapsed. And all sorts of anarchy broke loose in the Western Empire. So that would be today what we call Italy, Austria, Germany, France, Spain, England. Okay. The whole area became complete anarchy. The Eastern Roman Empire, which was Greece, the Levant, and so forth, Egypt, that survived and that maintained its structure. The Western one collapsed. And what happened was there was a bunch of Germanic tribes and warlords who invaded at that point and took over in different sections. Okay. So like the Alemanni were in one area, the Swabians in another area, the Visigoths in another area, the Eastern Goths in another area, the Vandals in another area. Okay. Goes on and on. And these warlords, they were not Christians. Okay. But the population that they were conquering were. And these warlords wanted to get legitimacy. And the way to get legitimacy with the population was to get the um, religious leaders who were Christian religious leaders to grant them legitimacy, okay, to crown them as a king or whatever in these areas. These warlords were also fighting each other, one against another, trying to take over the other. At the same time, these warlords were uneducated. They had no real understanding of the culture and the education system, the engineering systems, the infrastructure that the Romans had built. They respected it in the sense that they saw it, but they didn't know how to replicate it themselves. Okay, so in some of those cases, or actually many cases, these warlords simply acquiesce to what the only provider of those types of things who could help them was the Roman Catholic Church. Or it wasn't called the Roman Catholic Church at that time; it was just called the Church. Okay, the Church was the only institution that was able to maintain all of those, say we call them infrastructure of civilization, right? The schools, the hospitals, the education system for engineering, which obviously build infrastructure and so on and so on. The culture, the arts, everything. This was all being done by the church. So these warlords ended up having to make a marriage with the church, right? And try to get legitimacy of the church and so forth. And so many times the interests of a warlord would be used to he would use the church as a justification for him, slaughtering some breakaway province or something like that. Okay, that's part of the reason what went on with the Inquisition and part of the reason it went on with the Cathars. Okay, so you have to keep in mind that the church in this time is at that time is not the way it is today. It was a political situation. It was in the sense that it was running the affairs of state. And also, the the church itself, like I said, it was heavily involved in education, but also if you were a smart child, okay, and you obviously there was no education generally for people, right? Because there was no state education system. The church was the only place you could go to get education. So if you were a smart child, your parents might be lucky enough to get you for the church to basically accept you into their boarding schools and train you. Okay. And now, so the church itself, through time, has a lot of very smart people running things at the top. And basically, um, that's what all these monasteries are, right? They're full of very smart people. Um, and their objective was to reunify the Western Roman Empire. Okay, not to have it a collection of warring states run by warlords. They wanted and also to remove a lot of the very barbaric practices that these warlords were up to. So the church's concept was to again unify the areas. They didn't want it to continue to fracture and fracture and fracture. They wanted to become unified like it was before under the Romans, and they therefore then you could start to build the essential infrastructure that's required. So that's what you have to think about is that many of the times uh, that the church itself became a political actor, and even so far as there was actually a state called the Papal States, which was ruled by the Pope. Okay, it was an actual state, had its own army. Okay, so keep that in mind, and then also keep in mind that some of these warlord states, through time, with the assistance of the church, evolved into more modern states, right? So, like for example, France, and there's Austria as another one. Now, these states, they wanted to unify Western Europe, but under their dominion, right? So they would try to capture the authority of the church and use the church as a vehicle for them to unify Western Europe. Okay. So we have the Holy Roman Empire, which is basically Austria, okay, trying to do that. We also have France trying to do that. We had Spain trying to do that. Okay. So they're using the church to try to achieve their geopolitical ends of unification of Europe. So again, a lot of these things you complaints you might have about the Roman Catholic Church are actually misdirected. You're thinking about the Roman Catholic Church from the perspective of a political situation. Okay. So the step back now to think about some more other critiques that X2 by 2s will or 2 by 2s and X2 by 2s have about the established churches. One of the things they'll talk about are traditions. They'll say that, these established churches have these traditions, which are obviously not biblical. Okay. Now, this is half true and half false. They don't understand what the established churches were up to. They don't understand the project. They don't understand the starting conditions. Okay, what do I mean? Let's just take, for example, the concept of the Christmas tree. Okay, obviously it's a tradition in established churches, but not all. I mean, in fact, in Italy, you don't see very many people with Christmas trees, but you certainly see it in Central and Northern Europe. Now, what is going on here? What these areas of Europe I mentioned, the Western and Northern Europe, the people were not Christians. These were these Germanic tribe areas, and they were very barbarian. Okay, a lot of violence. When they had their, as you know, their pagan beliefs about, they were very mystical about nature, those kinds of things. Um, Odin, Thor, that kind of stuff. And there was a tree which they thought had mystical powers and they venerated and so forth. Now, when Christian missionaries went in there into these areas trying to convert these people, they had a lot of trouble. Uh, First of all, convert someone who's illiterate because all the population's illiterate. Okay. So you have to talk to people and you have to try to convince them with imagery and with symbols and artifacts. And it turns out a really good way to convert people is to try to accept some of their own traditions and say, yeah, that's we can accept that into ours as long as it's just a tradition and it doesn't really, I don't know, you can change the meaning of it, right? So this is what happened. They took the Christmas tree, said, okay, you guys are worshiping this tree. Okay, well, we're going to say, yes, the tree represents the Trinity because it's shaped like a triangle and so forth. And okay, as long as you just have it like, place less importance on this tree, but you can still have these trees and, blah, blah, blah. It's called, the concept is called synchronicity, right? To, to accept traditions of these quite, say, primitive peoples in order to get them on the path of conversion. Okay, we see this currently going on in with many indigenous people in South America, where I think there's something going on with I guess in Peru or Bolivia where there's some people who are where this is going on, and it certainly went on with Native Americans as well when they were converted. So there's nothing really wrong with it. It's just a way. It's a assistance mechanism. Now, okay, but X two by twos or two by twos will say, well, no, those aren't traditions exactly. We're talking about the tradition of crossing yourself or tradition of holy water and all these other things. Well, you know what? All of those things are tools, just as the Christmas tree is tools to get people into the door, to get them to start to absorb the faith and so forth. And also remember, there's a lot of people who are just not capable or don't want to spend the time to, do enormous reading and become, highly intellectual about the faith and so forth. They just, but you want to abandon them completely? No, you do not, because those people are, if they're not in the faith and learning the good habits of the faith, they're the kind of people who are going to produce probably quite bad family situations and generate a lot of social troubles as a result. So no, even if you think, oh, they're just doing the rituals, but they don't really understand it so deeply. Well, you know what? That's okay. That's okay. They're on the path, Maybe you can put in a nugget here and there. And if you attend these sorts of services, you understand it. Now it leads me to another point about established churches that are different than things like these two by twos or other non-established churches. Is that established churches are universal, meaning like it doesn't matter what ethnic group you are, which race, which social class, you all go to the same parish, the same church, and you all worship together as one. Okay. In that sense, it's very difficult to be racist person because you're intermixing with these people all the time. Now you're going to find amongst two by twos or so forth, they are a highly racist, ethnocentric type. Okay. It's yeah, they might have the odd token person who's not of their race, but generally speaking, it's they are apart from them. And one of the things you can notice, like if you go into areas of the United States or Canada and Australia where there are Aboriginals, okay, the two by twos really, they're obviously, like many people, are racist against Aboriginals. And Aboriginals, and certainly in the United States and Canada, are almost all Roman Catholics. Um, so as a result, when two by twos see that, they say, okay, these Aboriginals are, they're on average poor, on average, got problems with alcohol addiction and so forth, and therefore, and they're Roman Catholics. Like clear, this whole bundle goes together. It must be that's what Roman Catholics are, of course. Then poor and on drugs, basically. Okay, so they that it becomes part of their prejudicial notions, and it's also a great racist thing. And instead, what you could do is, if you were a person, you say, I could go to this Roman Catholic parish or whatever, and where all these Aboriginals are, and I could become part of the parish, and I could start to add my efforts to try to help these people inside their parish, as opposed to the idea of like, no, for that Aboriginal person to need help, they have to come and join my two by two parish, and then I might help them. Okay, that's the concept here. It's a racist concept, prejudicial, prideful. So again, the established churches are universal. These other groups, which are not, which are anti-established churches, are not universal. They are highly ethnocentric, racist type groups. They are trying to keep the riffraff out. And I'll even give you an example. There's a very famous story of someone who was a member of it's a congregationalist, so one of these types of church, pure type church, and their daughter ended up converting and become Roman Catholic. And the mother said to the daughter, "Oh, so now you're going to worship with the help, are you?" Meaning like you and our servants, the servants we have who clean the house, you're going to be worshiping with them, huh? I mean, it's beneath us. It's beneath our family, basically. And that's a concept that still exists in the United States because the vast majority of the Roman Catholics in the United States are people from ethnic groups who the so-called white population in the United States has great disdain for. Okay? Particularly Hispanics. Hispanics are generally considered a lower status level in the United States. So if you're a two by two or X two by two, you would not go to a Roman Catholic parish because, of course, you'd be with the Hispanics. Right? And of course, we all know the United States that Hispanics are the help, right? They're the ones who cut the grass, right? Okay, so that's the kind of stuff that goes on. These are highly racist ideas. It's embedded in here, and it even extends back to the Roman Catholics in the United States who were before the Hispanics came here. The vast majority were Irish and Italian. Okay, so you can imagine that the sentiment of people from England who came to the United States, what they thought about Irish. Of course, they thought Irish people were basically subhuman, and that was a common thing that was said in the United States at the time. And of course, Italians. Of course, what's wrong with Italians? Well, of course, according to these waspy Americans, the Italians, of course, are swarthy and so forth, right? And these are all Southern Italians, by the way. They came from a very poor area. They were very low education and so forth. But again, same concepts, same concepts. Again, these these critiques are so uh, out of context all the time. The misunderstanding of what the established churches have done as a benefit is never presented, right? Like, for example, in most of our time here in Western civilization, all of the education systems were provided by the church, by the established churches. All the hospitals by established churches. The idea that there would be secular systems doing this is a very recent phenomenon. Okay, the churches did all this stuff. Even today, I mean, I can drive around where I live, and there's the church. The names of the hospitals are something, name of the city Presbyterian Hospital, name of the city, Episcopal Hospital, whatever, because that's who initially started it, right? Even the great universities in the United States were all started by churches. Harvard was started by a church, Yale by a church, Brown by a church. Okay, these sorts of things. The idea that somehow you you know these churches, these established churches were all bad is ridiculous. Yes, there were some bad things that happened, and yes, there was corruption, but this is because of geopolitical situations. Okay, and yes, there are people in those congregations who are, just phoning it in, so to speak. Yes, but that's not the reality of the entirety. Yes, there are traditions that you may think that's sort of odd, but you don't have to participate in traditions. You don't have to. It's optional, right? The traditions are there to help people with their faith. They're tools, they're crutches as they move along in their faith. Same way you teach children. You teach them these traditions so that that becomes a architecture from which they can build their faith on. Obviously, you can't teach the child, hey, give a child, let's read Thomas Aquinas's meditation on the Gospels. You can't. The child can't do that. I don't think actually most adults seem capable of that. Anyways, there is a very, very anti-established church bias within the 2x2 and X2x2 community. It doesn't matter if if you're a Christian X2x2 or an atheist X2x2. I can guarantee you they have extreme, extreme anti-established churches. And the pinnacle of that anti-established church position is anti-Roman Catholic. Absolutely the single worst thing you can be from an X2x2's perspective or a 2x2's perspective is to be a Roman Catholic. I hope that helps.